The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, hello everybody. Welcome to the Lunch and Learn series, and warm welcome to everyone because this, of course, is our first unit of 6 units. So welcome to everyone. We've got people from all over Australia and overseas as well. So whatever time it is there, welcome. It's 12 midday here in Brisbane. So congratulations on joining the program. I'm looking forward to working with you over the course of several months. Now, if you've got questions, I want you to ask those questions during the presentation, and it's a very easy process. All you need to do is go over to the question box there on the right-hand side, and you'll notice that there's a little click there, open it up and type in your question. Now, if you type in a question there, the only person that actually gets to see the question is me. So I will respond to it halfway, immediately that I respond to your when I see your question. Okay, so I just want to make sure that I'm being heard. I've got a couple of comments here about that. Maybe we can have some practice in this if you haven't already done it. So if you go to the question box and just type in clear, that will let me know that I'm being heard. So could you do that? So otherwise I end up talking to myself for an hour, which probably isn't a good idea. Thanks, Darren. Thanks, Marianne. Thanks, Brock. Okay. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Jackie. Right, good. Excellent. Coming through loud and clear by the sound of it, which is great. So at least you know where the question box is. Thanks, Carlos. That's where you type in your question. Now, the reason I ask you to do that is that we want to make this as interactive as possible. Often with these webinars, we leave time at the end and there's this sort of awkward pause where people have to think about their questions. So if you've got a comment, question, observation, do type it in the moment you think about it, because I'll keep my eye out for that, and that way we keep it as interactive as possible. You could understand we can't unmute everybody because it would be impossible to do that because we'd have so much background noise. I wouldn't be heard. So that's why we do it through questions in the question box. All right, so let's get underway. So of course, the unit that we're doing today is very much looking at the ingredients of effective feedback. So let's look at the program in its entirety, and then of course I'll launch into today's topic. So what you can see on your screen now over on the left-hand side is the actual 6 modules that you've signed up to. Now, you might say, well, why did I select those units? Weren't there other units that were important? Well, absolutely. There are many, many things that are involved in leadership, of course. But I thought to myself that these are probably the 6 areas that you can have the greatest impact in the shortest amount of time. So that's why I've selected those from my own experience. Now, they're not necessarily in any order, although there is some logic to the order, but let me run through very briefly what the topics are so that you can understand where we're going on this journey. The other thing I would say to you is that you'll receive an email from me this afternoon, which will have the slides and recording. So the good news for you is part of your fee for signing up is to get the slides and recording. And that's great because the reality is you might want to go back and have a look at some of the slides, or perhaps even watch the full presentation again. If for some circumstances you're not able to make the webinar, then you can just watch the video. But I would encourage you to be involved. I would encourage you to register for all of those. So I'll send out another link this afternoon and register for all 5, because that way they're done. And what happens is that you receive reminders automated all the way through, which basically reminds you that it's coming up. And it'll also give you a facility to be able to put it into your calendar so that you can make it a priority. And so I'd strongly recommend you do that, because if you don't register, you won't be receiving emails from me, and that's problematic for you. And then you'll wonder why. All right, so we're going to look at the ingredients of effective feedback today. And in Unit 2, I'm going to send out a link this afternoon for you to complete an online diagnostic. And this online diagnostic is on influencing capabilities. And this will give you an opportunity to have a look at your own influencing style and approach, because the argument is that as leaders, we're actually in the business of influencing. So we'll have a look at that. In Unit 3, and these are all 2 weeks apart, we'll look at optimizing team performance. And in particular, what I'm talking about there is one-on-one communication with each of your team members. For Unit 4, we'll look at getting the very best from the people that you lead, and I'll be sharing with you some models and very practical action steps that you can take in order to get the very best from the people that you lead, because essentially that's critically important. For Unit 5, you'll get to do another diagnostic, although this will be a paper version. I haven't converted it over to an electronic version yet, and this will be understanding people and their personalities. And what you can do there is have a bit of fun and understand that the people that you work with obviously have different personalities, different motivations, different priorities. And of course, it's based on the platinum rule, which is treat people how they want to be treated, rather than the golden rule, which of course is treat people how you want to be treated. So if you treat people how they want to be treated, you'll tend to get a better result. And then in Unit 6, we'll look at facilitating effective meetings. Now, I'm not sure whether you all do run meetings. Certainly you're involved in meetings. We're all involved in meetings. We all have too many meetings in our life. But one of the core skills, I think, of being a leader is to be able to run effective meetings. So we're going to spend a bit of time doing that, and I'm going to share with you some practical tips and hints on how to get the best out of the meetings that you might share now or in the future. So essentially that's the Lunch and Learn series. And so if you've got any questions, comments, observations, you know what to do. Just go to the right-hand side on the question box and type in your question or your comment. All right, so let's get stuck into today's session, which of course is about feedback. And let me make a couple of comments about feedback. The surveys consistently show, and it's not just in Australia, the surveys all over the world consistently show that employees feel that they're not getting enough feedback from their leader. Now, there's a variety of reasons for that, but nevertheless, that is the general consensus in all the surveys around the world in relation to feedback. Now, what you're looking at there in front of you now is a slide which actually shows you some interesting insights into feedback. Now, look at the top column, the top bar. It says receiving strength-based feedback, which we could call positive feedback. So this is about people doing the right thing and you giving feedback on that. So if you give people positive feedback, you're obviously most likely going to engage people, and that's a good thing. Now, obviously not everything that people do is positive or strength-based, so we've got to give negative feedback as well. But even if you just gave positive feedback and nothing more, you can see that you'd have a high level of engagement with your team. So that's the good news. And what will happen at the end of each of these units is that I will give you some homework to do. And the homework, of course, will be very practical. It'll be things that you're required to do. And the good news for you is if you're in Australia and it's about 12 midday, you'll get an opportunity this afternoon to practice. And of course, all next week and the week after until we meet again. So if you give positive feedback, you will get engagement, all things being equal, of course. If you only give critical feedback, which is the second bar there, you'll notice that there's still a high level of engagement. Now that's interesting. So if you only ever pull people up when they were doing it wrong, you will actually get a reasonable level of engagement. Now, a lot of people don't understand that, but that's the reality of it. Now, the other thing that's important there is at the bottom bar, which shows you the receiving no feedback. So this is employees who get absolutely no feedback at all from their boss. You'll notice there's a high level of disengagement. So what's the moral of the story? Well, the moral of the story is if you want disengaged team members, the best thing that you can do is give no feedback. If you want a moderate level of engagement, then you should be giving critical feedback at least. And of course, if you want very engaged employees, all things being equal, then you need to give constant, regular, timely feedback. And if you do that, both positive and negative, you're likely to get a better result. So you can guess perhaps what your homework's going to be after this webinar today, and that'll be to start giving feedback. Start giving more feedback if you're not giving enough. And it's a relatively easy exercise to do, and I'm going to lead you through a process of how you might do that. So, moving right along. So here is some interesting stats that you might like to think about before we move on any further. Roughly by a 3-to-1 margin, employees believe that constructive feedback does more to improve their performance than positive feedback. All right, so what basically that's saying is that people want any feedback, good, bad, or whatever. So, of course, what we've got to learn is how to give good feedback and poor and negative feedback as well. So obviously today I'm going to talk about that. So what people are saying is they basically want feedback. Now, uh, this is a fundamental human need. The truth of the matter is that we all need to know where we stand. We mightn't always like the line in the sand, but we all need to know where the line in the sand is. And for you as a leader to give feedback is a way of actually drawing that line in the sand so that people clearly understand what the reality is. Thanks, Darren, for that feedback. Darren just says very true. Okay, good. Thank you. Now, the secret to having employees listen to your feedback is whether or not they respect you. Now, here's the dimension that becomes interesting. If people don't respect you, you can try all of these techniques and strategies and everything else that I'm going to share with you today, and it won't work. So it is important that people respect you, and respect is different from liking, by the way. So the reality is there needs to be a fundamental level of respect from you. Now, the paradox of this is if you give no feedback at all, positive or negative, you're likely to have a lack of respect from people. So you've kind of got to start giving feedback as a means of gaining respect. But if the respect isn't there at all, baseline, then it's not going to make much difference. So as it says there on the screen, respect is earned, incredibly hard to get, and requires authenticity. So one of the things, or one of the themes that I'll be running through in the Lunch and Learn is this notion of authenticity. Authenticity means being yourself. And what leadership really is about being more of who you are, not something else. So this is about being open, authentic, respectful, and trustworthy. So these are the ingredients of being a positive leader, a leader of influence, in other words. All right, so you could have exactly, and this is true, that you could have exactly the same thing said to two different people and get two different effects because you don't have a good working relationship with one team member and you have a very good working relationship with another, and you give exactly the same feedback to both. One is likely to fall on deaf ears and the other is likely to be absorbed and accepted. And that's based on your working relationship. So it's critically important that we develop good working relationships with the people that we lead. And of course, we'll be talking more about that as we go through the program. Now, I wrote a book a few years ago now entitled The End of the Performance Review. Now, often what happens, and this is a busy slide, but I'll just draw a few interesting conclusions out of this. Performance reviews are not feedback. Sure, we do it once or twice a year and your organisation might be wedded to the performance review, and you may give feedback, but really I'm talking about regular, ongoing, day-to-day, moment by moment, incident by incident feedback. I'm not talking about once or twice a year, because the problem with performance reviews, as I see it, is that people as managers will often store up all of their feedback, particularly if it's negative, and decide to give it during the performance review. So that by the time the performance review comes around, then it's fallen on deaf ears, because reality is that people are thinking to themselves, if you really thought that was important, you would have given me that feedback 6 months ago. So if you say to someone, for example, I forgot to mention, or I didn't get a chance to mention that your contribution in that meeting was outstanding. It really added value to what we're trying to do. So let's say that's your feedback in the performance review. The person on the receiving end of that, whilst they're probably not going to be disappointed about hearing that, it's probably going to have not a lot of impact, because the person's thinking to themselves, well, why didn't you say it to me 6 months ago if it was that true? And of course, the same is the case if you've got negative feedback. So this is one of the problems of the performance review, is that managers will often save up their feedback for this one big event, or twice a year, whichever way you go in your organisation. So these stats that you're seeing in front of you are pretty damning if you think about it. 30% of performance reviews end up decreasing employee performance, okay, according to the Psychological Bulletin. So that's not good news. 58% of executives believe that their current programs don't result in performance or engagement. So the majority of executives who Deloitte's interviewed basically believe that performance reviews aren't effective. 70% of companies are now reconsidering their performance strategy, and I know this because a lot of my work is in this area. And so a whopping 70% are looking at their whole review. Perhaps they're looking at the paperwork, perhaps they're looking at giving managers more training or whatever. All of those things make up the 70%. 2 out of 3 employees with highest performance scores aren't actually the highest performers. So this is where we give people ratings without much thought. So, for example, if it's a 5-point rating, we might give a person a 3 when in actual fact they should be a 2 or even a 4, because we don't, we want to we don't want to rock the boat. So ratings themselves are not terribly useful as well. 6% of companies surveyed think that performance reviews are not worth the time. I beg your pardon. So that means that a whopping 94% of people think that performance reviews are a waste of time. 2% of HR executives say that yearly evaluations are useful. That's not terribly many, is it? 80% of workers are dissatisfied with the performance reviews. 80%. So only 20% are happy. And if 3% or 3 to 5% improvement in performance of all managers believe will be generated in the process. So those stats would demonstrate that the performance review is not the effective place to be giving feedback. And I understand that some of your organisations are really in a difficult bind, because you can't get rid of the performance review, particularly if you're in the public sector. And I know we've got quite a few in the public sector, and I understand that. But of course, what that means is that cynicism comes into play, and that people get upset with the performance review. So if nobody really likes it, and I've never seen any research anywhere in the world that actually shows that performance reviews actually increase performance. And so I guess the question is, why do we do it? But I guess I shouldn't get too worked up about that, other than to say that the performance review is not the mechanism for you to be giving feedback. Now, I want to talk a little bit about managing expectations. Managing expectations sounds like a nice, simple phrase, doesn't it? But managing expectations is quite complex. And I'd like you to have a think about this as I go through, and think, how well do I do these 7 things? Because managing expectations, if you don't have expectations in the first place, then it's very hard to give feedback. Or, of course, people are thinking, well, I don't know where the line in the sand is, which is, of course, your expectation. So let's have a look at expectations. The most fundamental question that has to be asked right at the beginning is, what are your expectations as a leader? Are you absolutely clear what you expect of other people in your working environment? Now, that might sound like a very obvious question, but sometimes it's not that clear. So if I was talking to you one-on-one, would you be able to articulate to me, say, 6 or 7 key result areas? And would you be able to tell me what your baseline expectation is in each of those 6 or 7 key result areas? That's the fundamental starting point, because obviously if you don't know what your expectations are, then that's not a good start. The second key question that needs to be asked then is, have I communicated those expectations to my team members? Now, this is critically important because obviously people aren't mind readers. They need to know what your expectations are. Now, you might say, well, I think it's very obvious, not good enough. People need to know. And not only do they need to know, they need to be consistently pointed to what those expectations are. So the key message there is being consistent and persistent. Consistent as in my expectations don't change, and persistent means that I'm continually communicating those to my team. All right, so they're the first 2 questions that need to be asked. And are you doing that? And are you doing that consistently and persistently? The third key question that you need to be able to answer is, does your team actually understand your expectations? So it's one thing to communicate it. It's another thing for them to actually understand it. So this is often a case I found in my experience, that just because I've communicated my expectations to people doesn't necessarily mean that they appreciate or understand why those expectations are there. So I need to spend a little bit of time one-on-one and also in my team meetings to explain to people what those expectations are, why they're important, and how they impact. The next key question we've got to then ask ourselves is, do my team members accept my expectations? So just because you've communicated them, just because they understand them, doesn't necessarily mean that they accept them. And so we need to get some commitment from other people that they accept your expectations, because obviously if people don't accept your expectations, what that basically means is they're probably not likely to meet them. So we need to get people to accept where the line in the sand is, and that becomes critically important. The next question we've got to ask then is, are my team members actually committed to meeting those expectations? So it's one thing accepting them as reasonable. It's another thing getting a sense of commitment as to what they might be. So it's really important that we actually ask people for their commitment. Have you thought about doing that? So, for example, if you've explained to people what an expectation is, just look them straight in the eye if they're in your office or in your vicinity and say, can I get your commitment that you'll meet those expectations? Nothing wrong with that. You need to know that they're committed to meeting those expectations. And of course, if they're not willing to commit to those expectations, then you can have another conversation around why. But it's important to get explicit commitment to meeting those expectations. So you can see it's quite a complex involvement, isn't it, managing expectations. And then, of course, the next key question, once you've responded to that, is, do my team members know how they're performing against those expectations? So going back, I know what my expectations are. I've communicated my expectations. People understand what my expectations are. People accept them. People are committed to them. And people actually know how they're performing against those expectations. So this is, of course, where feedback comes in. But you can see that before we give feedback to people, we need to be absolutely crystal clear about being clear about our expectations and how we communicate that to other people. And the next question that we've got to ask is, am I supporting my team members to meet those expectations? Now, what that means, of course, is that people will often need support. So what does that mean? It means we've got to provide them with learning and development opportunities. It might mean we've got to explain how things are done. It might mean that we need to move organisational barriers. There are a whole bunch of things that can get in the way of people achieving the expectations that you've set for them. So the question then is to work out what's stopping people meeting those expectations and what you can do about that. So you can see that it's quite a complex environment. I don't want to scare people off, but at the end of the day, when you look at those 7 questions, you've got to ask yourself, which of those could I be doing more effectively? Which of those have I bypassed? And so it's important for you to reflect on that screen and just think to yourself, well, have I done all those things? And the answer, if you have done all those things, then well done. You are managing expectations very well. If you haven't, then there's work in progress. You need to go back and have a think about some of those things and explain it. I should also say that the best opportunity to manage expectations is one-on-one. Just because you have a team meeting this afternoon or Monday morning or whatever it is, and you sort of give everyone a bit of a lecture about what your expectations are, it's likely that it'll have some impact, but it probably isn't going to have the impact that you think it should. And the reason for that is everyone's sitting in that room thinking, oh, I'm glad so-and-so's given that feedback. I'm glad my leader's done that. I'm glad my leader's managing expectations. But there are other people around this table that need to hear this. Of course, I don't. And of course, if everyone thinks that, then it's fallen on deaf ears. So one-on-one feedback is critically important in the process. All right. So guys, if you've got any questions, comments, observations, type them in the question box because happy to take them as we go. So while you might be thinking of that, let's move on. So I want to talk now about some of the key issues around giving feedback, some of the things that I'd like you to have a think about when you're giving feedback. One of the core issues around giving feedback is the timing of when you give that feedback. Now, I can say to you for sure that the very best time to give feedback is immediately after the critical incident or the event or the situation or the behaviour, whatever it is. That's the best time. Why? Because it's fresh. You can refer to the critical incident. You can refer to the behaviour. You're sending a very clear message to the other person that it's important to you. How do they know that? Because you've decided to make it a priority by giving feedback right there at that point. Now, we all know that's sometimes not possible. You might be in the middle of something, or you've got a meeting that you're in, or you're rushing off to speak to somebody. So we all know that it's not always possible to give immediate feedback. But the issue here for you is that the more immediate it is, the better. And of course, the flip side's true. The longer it takes for you to give feedback, the longer, the more problematic it is and the less impact it'll have. Okay, we've got a couple of questions here. I'll just deal with that. Invite the team to challenge the current expectations, help with buy-in, helps better expectations. Your thoughts? Jackie, great question. Should we allow people to challenge your expectations? Absolutely. I'd rather have people challenge my expectations openly than sort of think in their head, I'm not going to do such and such because I think that the crossbar is too high, or that's unrealistic, or there's a whole bunch of barriers in the way. So I would rather people being explicit about it. So yes, the whole idea is to ask people. So one of the key questions out of those 7 was to ask people for their commitment to meet that expectation. Now, there's nothing wrong with asking that. It's a very reasonable and respectful thing to do. Can I get your commitment that you'll meet that expectation in future? Now, if they've got a problem with your expectation, you've opened the door for the possibility for them to discuss that with you. And I think that's a healthy thing. So absolutely, Jackie, I think, people should be questioning feedback and, questioning expectations. So by all means, engage with them, because obviously if people have got a problem with the standards that you're setting, then they're not going to meet them. But the problem is if you don't discuss them, you won't know. And of course, you'll just be guessing. So of course, raise it with people. It's much better to raise it with people. And of course, I think your question is also alluding to the reality that if you ask people and they engage in it, then what's likely to happen is they're going to have some ownership of that, which is a great thing in my view. So thanks, Jackie, for the question. So timing's critically important. Now, the second key point in giving feedback is that you need to be very specific about what the feedback is. And I'm going to spend a bit of time on this because I think a lot of people have problems with this. The more specific the feedback, the more likely it is for people to actually understand what's right and wrong with the feedback, rather than the generalized comments about, can you imagine what would happen, for example, if you said to somebody, you need to get a better attitude. Your attitude's very poor. Now, whilst in your head that might be absolutely true, and you feel an obligation to give that person that feedback, the reality is you haven't been very specific. Now, on the other hand, if you said to that person, the last 4 meetings we've had, you've been very critical of suggestions that have been raised by other team members, and I have a problem with that. I need you to be more positive in those situations. Can you see the difference? Because I can draw attention to a critical incident, in this case 4, and I can actually point out to them the specifics of the behaviour that I want to change. Now, will they like you saying that? Probably not. They'll probably get defensive. They might suggest that they're doing that because they know it's not going to work or whatever. But it's far less likely that they're going to get they'll just be dismissive if you just talk about them having a rotten attitude, and probably likely you'll see their attitude emerge once you do that. So be very specific about what you're after. Let me talk a little bit more about that, because I think this is an area that people do have some difficulty with. So make your feedback specific. So here's an example. See, over on the left-hand side there, if you said to someone, overall, good job on the presentation at this morning's meeting, but it could have been better. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, it's great that you're giving that feedback, but the person's sort of guessing about, what they liked about it and what could I do better. So it's left open a whole bunch of questions that haven't been answered. And unless that person's very assertive and says to the leader, well, can you be more specific, or can you explain what you liked about it, or can you explain what I could have done better, it's likely that they'll walk away wondering. So the feedback's not going to be very useful because it's not very specific. So it's too vague. So what was actually wrong? Plus, just because you didn't like it doesn't necessarily mean it was bad. So how could it have been better? So here's perhaps a better way of dealing with that type of feedback, which essentially is positive feedback. So if you'd said something like this, good job on the presentation. I really liked how you used statistics to back up your key points. You see how I'm being specific? One small comment. Maybe for next time you could invite more comments from the group and try to get them more involved. Can you see how that's much more effective because it's much more specific? And again, it's up to the employee to take that on board, but I can assure you they're far more likely to take that on board than they are for you to just say, overall good job at the meeting this morning, but it could have been better. They're not likely to get anything useful out of that at all. So you can see that being very specific. So what does that actually mean? Well, it means you need to think carefully before you open your trap. So bite your tongue until it bleeds, until you're ready to be specific about the feedback that you're going to give people. So what did you like? What didn't you like? And the more likely you are to be specific, the more likely it is to hit the mark, assuming, of course, it's fairly immediate. Now, the third dimension that's critically important in all of this is frequency. You should be giving regular feedback, moment by moment, incident by incident, project by project, meeting by meeting, behaviour by behaviour. Your feedback should be happening all the time. And if you look at good leaders, you will find that they are used to giving feedback every day. They'll give it in all sorts of circumstances. So your homework is actually going to be about giving 3 bits of feedback each day. And I want you to start getting into the habit before we get too far into lunch and learn to start giving frequent feedback, regular feedback. And so by doing that, you're going to get used to it. And those of you who may feel uncomfortable about it, trust me, if you start somewhere, you will get far more comfortable as the process goes. So frequent feedback is critically important. Now, sometimes you can't plan when you're going to give this feedback because you don't know. So it means that you've got to be ready, willing, and able to give feedback in the corridor, or out in the field, or in the car, or after the meeting, or before the meeting, wherever it might be. It's important for you to take the opportunity to do that. It doesn't have to be an hour-long meeting. This can be done in a couple of minutes, or even less. And that in itself would be a very effective thing to do. Now, the other thing I would strongly urge you to do when you are giving feedback is to ask lots of questions. Feedback is not a process where you're just simply dumping on someone else, or you are actually opening up a dialogue. It comes back to Jackie's comment before. You are trying to engage the other person in the feedback. So, for example, you might say to somebody, let's say somebody's had a very stressful conversation over the phone in an open office environment, and you happen to overhear that conversation, and the person's lost their cool during the conversation, has got quite heated, and it's obviously an opportunity for you to sit down with that person and give them some feedback. So you might pull them aside and you might say, look, I just overheard that conversation that you had with that customer on the phone, or client, or whoever it was. How did you think you went? Or how did you feel about that? So you get them talking early on in the process. Now, it's likely if it was a difficult encounter that they'll probably talk about that. You might then say, well, how might you have done it better given another opportunity? Because you will surely get another opportunity. So you see, I can actually lead a feedback session by asking the other person a bunch of questions to elicit from them how they felt they'd performed in that situation. And because it's immediately after, and because it's specific to that phone call, it's likely to be a very effective conversation. All right. Now, if you left it for a week or two to let them calm down, there might be a case where they're thinking to themselves, well, I know you overheard it. If you really thought it was that important, you would have done it. So you can see that that becomes a problem if you don't do it immediately. Another issue with feedback, I think, is very, very important, is that you should be giving feedback in private. Now, a lot of people will have this idea that you can praise in public and criticize in private. I think half of that's true. I think, though, you should be both praising and criticizing in private. The reason is that some people in your team are quite shy, perhaps they're introvert. The last thing they want is attention drawn to them, even positive feedback. So the best way to go about that, of course, is to try to find a place where you can give that feedback. Now, this is problematic in open office environments, and I know many of you work in open office environments, so I would suggest that you've got to find somewhere outside, a room, somewhere in private to talk about the incident. Don't do this in an open office environment in front of everybody else, because it can be embarrassing, even if it's very positive. People sometimes don't like attention drawn to them at all. So my suggestion is all feedback should be done in private. So what do you guys think about that? Do you think that's a fair and reasonable assertion of mine, or do you think, I'm sure there is times when you have a morning tea or something, you can recognize people, and I think there's always that opportunity. But I generally think that as a rule of thumb, the idea is to give feedback in private, good, bad, or indifferent. Excuse me. Now, the other thing that I would suggest to you is that when you're giving feedback, you use critical incidents. Now, what do I mean by critical incidents? Well, examples. You use the examples that have occurred, preferably at the time. So if somebody has lost their cool and spoken to someone in a disrespectful way, which requires you to intervene and then to sit down with that person later after the meeting, then of course you can use that critical incident to talk about perhaps the way they might be not showing respect to other people. So critical incidents are critical because you can't talk in generalities. If you start talking in generalities, people will get particularly upset. They will draw conclusions that you're picking on them and all sorts of strange assertions. So the point is to use critical incidents to demonstrate your point, and that becomes very important to do. Now, another important point is remember that the focus is on the future. So the important thing to think about here is that when you're giving feedback, there's nothing that you can do about the past. Absolutely nothing. It's gone. It's finished. There's no, you should have done this, or why did you do that? That's just illogical. It's all happened. It's gone. It's history. It's no longer possible to change those circumstances. So the best you can do, and the whole purpose of feedback, is actually to get a focus on the future. So you want to try and reinforce the positive behaviours that have occurred and hopefully get people to share those or to use those positive behaviours in the future more so than they currently are. So that's why you'd give positive feedback. And also, if you've got negative feedback to give, then you want people to change their behaviour or the way they think for the future. So it's important to focus on the future. And I think that sometimes people get caught up in blame games and he said this or she said that. At the end of the day, what's happened has happened. The reality is, once you understand what it is that they've done or not done, and you want to change that, it's a change for the future, not the past. So focus on the future is really important. So one of the most difficult bits of feedback, of course, is giving feedback on poor performance. So I want to spend a bit of time just talking about a couple of key things here that become critically important when you've got to sit down with people. From my experience, a lot of people avoid these conversations because they find them stressful and they're worried about opening a can of worms. But strangely, or not strangely, what really happens as a result of that is that behaviour never changes. And one of the reasons the behaviour never changes is the person often doesn't even know that they're doing the wrong thing, believe it or not. They should know, but they don't know. So you really can't afford to avoid this. So you really have to sit down with people and you really have to talk about the poor performance. So the question then is, how do you do that? A couple of key things that are critically important. So let's say that you've got to pull someone aside. You've noticed a critical incident. It's been negative. It was poor performance, and you've decided that you want to give them feedback. Once you ask people if you can have a word with them, obviously they're thinking to themselves, wonder what all this is about. They might know, but they probably are guessing. And so this is not a time for you to have chit-chat or to sort of, smooth the waters, if you like. The point here is that you get straight to the point. So you explain the circumstances that have occurred and you get straight to the point. So no small talk. This is about getting, now I don't mean in a hostile way, I just simply mean get to the point. And then explain in a sentence or two the purpose of the meeting. Now, this is extremely important, and what you need to do is to think very carefully about how you're going to articulate the reason that you've asked this person or called this person away from their workstation or wherever it is. So explain to them. So the reason that I want to meet with you is to talk about that exchange you just had with the customer. All right, so I've explained that. I haven't said that really shocking exchange, or I haven't said that really good exchange. I've just talked about the critical incident so that the person has a context about what I want to talk to them about. And the third point there is that once you have explained the purpose of the meeting, then you just bite your tongue until it bleeds and you ask the person what they thought about that critical incident. So I might say, well, what were your impressions about that incident? So what I'm doing is I'm getting the other person to engage in the feedback session before I'm ready to hit them right between the eyes and explain all the things that I'm critical about in that exchange, you see. And it also gives you a chance, by getting the other person to talk, for you to catch your breath, calmly listen, and to think about what you're going to say next. So the whole idea here is to start getting other people to contribute to the conversation as quickly as you possibly can. So there are 3 key points. There are some other points too. While that person's talking, it is really, really important for you not to interrupt them. Now, I know that's easier said than done because often people will say all sorts of strange things. Some things are completely inaccurate. Some things might even be baiting you. But you must calmly listen to what they say. Now, why do I think that's important? Because once they've drawn breath and finished saying what they've said, you can then correct them or add your comment. So you might say, look, there are a couple of things that you said there that I disagree with, and then explain what they are, rather than interrupt them once they've mentioned that. Now, there's a reason for that. There's a moral reason for that. You're actually wanting that person to actually listen to your feedback. Now, they're not likely to listen to your feedback if you've interrupted them all the way through. And if they do decide to interrupt you while you're right in the midst of giving feedback, then you can calmly say to them, well, just a moment, hear me out. I gave you the courtesy of listening to what you had to say. I'd appreciate the same courtesy. And of course, you're in the moral high ground there because you've actually given them a chance to say whatever they want to say, good, bad, or indifferent. Some other key things that are important in the poor conversation feedback session is avoid confrontation. This is not an exchange of argument. This is not an argument. This is not a confrontation. They might think it is, but from your point of view, it's not about that. That doesn't mean that you don't talk about tough issues. But the important thing here is not to argue. And in fact, there are 2 things that you can do here that are very effective. You can actually say to the other person, let's agree to disagree. All right? So that moves the conversation on to something else. Or you can just simply say to the other person, I refuse to argue with you about this. Now, both of those are very powerful statements because you've disengaged in a potential confrontation. Because really, that's not the nature, that's not the purpose of it. The purpose is to improve their performance. And if you're having an argument about it, it's highly unlikely that they're going to improve their performance, and it's probably going to discourage you from giving any future feedback because it's such an unpleasant situation. The important thing for you also is to focus on the performance, not the person. So this is why critical incidents are very important. Focus on what they're doing or not doing, not who they are. All right, now this is important and a good justification for using critical incidents when you're explaining things. As I said earlier, focus on the future. So talk about what they may do differently next time. Ask them for their commitment to change their behaviour next time. There's nothing wrong with that. In fact, there's everything right with that. So ask them for their commitment that next time they're going to change. And the important thing too in these conversations, these performance conversations, is emphasize the strengths as well as the weaknesses. So the very least that you can say at the end of a piece of performance feedback that's negative is, I am very confident that we can rectify this, or I'm very confident that you will be able to do this differently next time. Now, you must be confident, because if you weren't confident, why would you bother be sitting down with them giving that feedback in the first place? Otherwise, you're wasting your time. So that's the very least that you can say during a poor performance conversation. And of course, you can focus on other things that are more positive in that conversation. Now, it's not about sugarcoating it. At the end of the day, people need to understand that you're not happy. People need to understand specifically what the behaviour is or isn't, and people need to understand what's expected. That's your expectations. And people need to give you a commitment that they will work hard to try to change that behaviour for the future. All right, so that's important, all of those things. All right, and finally, in this session here is seek out the causes. Sometimes things are quite complex. So ask them why this happened or what got in the way. So for example, if somebody's written a report that's riddled with mistakes and inaccuracies, instead of just blasting them for that, perhaps ask them the question and say, well, look, why you can see there are a lot of mistakes here, and really this is not meeting my expectations. So what's happened? And then they actually say to you, oh, well, unfortunately, I couldn't get the information I needed from another section or department or team, and they didn't meet their deadline, so I had to rush at the last minute. Now, you might interpret that as an excuse, but the reality is there's some issue there that needs to be rectified, and that is that your team member gets timely information. So you might decide to look into that on behalf of the team member. All right, so there's some key things that I'd like you to have a think about. And of course, it's easy to do in a broadcast like this, isn't it? But of course, you've got to take that deep breath and have a go. But there are a few principles there that I think will stand you in good stead for the future. So guys, any questions, comments, observations? Now's your time to consider them, because we're coming towards the end of our first unit. All right, while you think about that, here's the homework for you. And as I said to you at the outset, at the end of each Lunch and Learn unit, you'll receive some practical homework to do. And this is to try a few things, because obviously, otherwise, the Lunch and Learn series isn't really effective, even though it might be informative, unless you, as the leader, change some behaviours. So what I'd like you to do is this. And you can start this afternoon if it's lunchtime where you are, or whenever, as soon as possible, basically. Make a commitment, that's a commitment to yourself, to give feedback 3 times a day for the next week. So I actually want you to give 15 pieces of feedback in the next 5 days. Now you might say, well, wow, that's a lot. I've got a lot of work to do. I can't find room for that. Well, I would argue this is part of your job. And the other thing you might say is, well, what happens if there's nothing that I can give feedback on? Well, there's always something that you can give feedback on, always. The question is to attune yourself to that. So I want you to look for some feedback. We've just got a question here, which I'm going to read out. And thank you. Thanks, Charlotte. So the question is, please go further on the benefits of giving positive feedback in private. My thoughts would be also include the team. Do some people use arguments as a okay, that's another question. Look, I I guess my point is that some people feel very embarrassed, Charlotte, about giving or receiving feedback, positive even. And I don't want to take that risk, because if they're sitting there embarrassed about attention being drawn to them, they may not take on board the feedback that I'm giving them. So isn't it more sincere to actually pull them aside, eye to eye, and explain to them that you're really happy with the way they dealt with that very difficult situation in the office just a moment ago? That's much more effective than to wait 2 or 3 days when you've got all the team together and then talk about that person and their behaviour. That's my point about that, and I'm just simply covering off on the potential for people to not feel comfortable. So that hopefully answers your question to some extent. Do people use arguments as a defence against being challenged to change? Thanks, Jackie. How do I deal with this? Excellent question. Jackie, people do this all the time. They'll use intimidation. They'll use all sorts of smokescreen ways of not taking responsibility for the feedback that you give them. And what I suggest to you there is that you say to people, look, I'm not going to argue with you about it. I simply want you to understand that my expectation is X, and that what I just saw or what I just witnessed there was Y. There's a difference between the way you handle that situation and the way I expected you to handle that situation. Perhaps I wasn't clear about what it was that was my expectation, so I take a bit of responsibility, you see, to suggest that it might be my issue. And what I need from you is a commitment that you will modify your behaviour next time so that that doesn't happen. You see, so you keep coming back to the issue, and but you're right, people will do this, and I think you've just got to be firm. You've got to take a deep breath, and you've got to let the person know that this is not about having arguments. This is about simply making sure you're clear about what I'm about, and that the behaviour that I saw was inconsistent with that. All right? There is no other way. And after a while, you can train people to accept feedback. And of course, this is the other side of things that's very interesting, that the more feedback you give, the more likely it is people will accept it in the vein that it's given. So, interestingly enough, you're training people to accept feedback when you do it right. So hopefully that's responded to your question, Jackie. All right, so is everyone clear about their homework? That's what you need to do. Now you might say, how will I remember that? Well, if on your computer screen, you might put down three bits of feedback, or write down in your diary 3 bits of feedback. And every day you come to work for the next week, I want you to be obsessed with just 3 bits of feedback. I don't want you to go home at night until you've given 3 bits of feedback. I'm just wanting you to get comfortable with doing this, and I want you to try some of the things, of course, that we've learned today. All right. So that brings us pretty much to the end of our first unit. I hope you've got something useful out of that. You'll notice, of course, we've got another 5 units in front of you. The next thing, of course, is for module or unit 2, enhancing your personal influence. And I'll be sending you an email out this afternoon with a recording plus the slides. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to working with you, and I'm always open to feedback as well. So the thing is, you've got my email address. You can send me an email, tell me what you've tried, tell me what didn't work. So part of the deal in all of this is for you to communicate with me, see me as your coach, mentor, whatever you want to call it. Thanks, Darren, for the feedback. Appreciate that. And guys, look forward to seeing you in exactly 2 weeks' time. Thank you and goodbye.